Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. We're going to be talking about the impacts that addictions has on the workplace and health and safety in the workplace. I'm Charmaine Hammond. I'll be the host for this webinar. I have a background working in the field of conflict resolution. For many years after leaving the correctional system as a correctional officer, where I worked for many years, I became a mediator. I went back to school, got a master's degree in conflict analysis and management. And as a mediator, I dealt with all kinds of conflict and many, many challenges that impact conflict in the workplace. Now I speak, train, and consult on building healthy, resilient workplaces, resolving conflict in the workplace, and creating a workplace that is psychologically healthy and safe. I'm going to introduce our two guests now before we dive into a great conversation. Let me start with Candace Plattor. Candace is an addictions therapist in private practice where she specializes in working with the family and the other loved ones of people who are struggling with addiction. She uses her unique and signature family addiction counseling and therapy program. As a former opioid addict with over 35 years clean and sober, Candace has learned that overcoming addiction is really a family condition. Everyone in the family is affected by the addiction, and everyone in the family needs to heal. For more than 3 decades, she has been helping both addicts and their loved ones understand their dysfunctional behaviors and make healthier life choices. She is a sought-after professional speaker, a member of CAPS, which is the Canadian Association of Professional Speakers. She's a TEDx speaker and a frequent guest on podcasts and media interviews. Candace is also the award-winning author of the book titled Loving an Addict, Loving Yourself, the top 10 survival tips for loving someone with an addiction. Welcome, Candace. And Mike Russo is a health and safety consultant at WorkBright, and he teaches part-time at Toronto Metropolitan University. He is a Canadian registered safety professional and registered occupational hygienist. With over a decade of experience working with one of Ontario's largest health and safety associations, he has advised employers, associations, and unions across Ontario on matters related to health and safety, including workplace violence and harassment. Throughout his career, he has helped organizations comply with health and safety policies and regulations, avoid costly claims, and most importantly, keep employees healthy and safe. Welcome, Mike. I think this is going to be a great conversation today, a really important and timely conversation. I know, Mike, you'll be talking about some of the changes that are coming up in Ontario on June 1st. And I thought before we get to what that is and have both of you speaking to that, I thought it'd be great to start with Candace to bring us all up to speed on the same language as about what is addictions anyways, because we often think of just alcohol or drugs, and I know it's bigger than that. So Candace, I'm going to pass it to you to tell us what is addictions anyways.
Okay. Well, addiction, there are a lot of different schools of thought about addiction. Some people think it's a disease and some people think it's something you learn at home. And addiction is across the board. You can use anything addictively. And the reason that people use addictions, addictive behaviors, alcohol, drugs, gambling, porn, chocolate, that's one of my favorites, is to be able to feel different. And what's happening for most people is that they don't like their situation. They don't like the life that they're in some way. They don't like themselves in some ways. And they're trying to get away from that. So for most people, they want to feel better. Some people don't just feel like they deserve to feel better, and they use addictions to actually feel worse about themselves. What I like to say is that I think that addiction is basically a choice that people make. I don't think that anybody chooses to become an addict. I need to say that. I know I didn't. Nobody really says to themselves, gee, let's be an addict. That'll be fun. But once we're in addiction, once we know that we're there, we have a choice about whether to stay there or whether to come into some kind of recovery. So I'm hoping that if anybody's listening to this and is struggling with addiction or knows someone who is, you'll understand that this is a choice that people are making.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for sharing that, Candace. And I know it's so important when you speak about addictions, you speak about that array of addictions, which we often see in workplaces. There's certainly drugs and alcohol, and then there's all kinds of other addictions that can create challenges in the workplace. And also, there are times when people are dealing with addictions at home. A loved one has an addiction, and then they're bringing that into the workplace. And I wonder if you can just share a bit about that before we pass it over to Mike to talk about what's coming down in June.
Yeah, sure. You know, when somebody's in the workplace and they themselves are addicted, and especially if it's a mind-altering addiction like alcohol or drugs, mistakes can be made. Really important mistakes that shouldn't be made can be made, which makes it unsafe for everybody.
Yeah.
When you've got somebody who is the loved one of somebody with an addiction coming to work, who is in their mind, they're focused on that person that they love so much. They're so frustrated. They're so scared. They're terrified this person could die. Too many people are dying from addiction. You know, they're still awake at 3 o'clock in the morning if they've had any sleep, and they go into work in that state. And mistakes can be made there too. This can really affect how a person does their work. So it's really important to be able to look at both the addict and the people who love them, because people who love addicts can make some really important changes to make their situation better.
Yes. And, you know, as a mediator, I used to see the impacts that would challenge conversation and communication. So often when people were coming into the workplace and they might have been dealing with addictions at home, it impacted their ability to not only make those decisions and be safe, it impacted their ability to process communication and to effectively resolve conflicts and deal with trust issues. So the list, I'm sure if the three of us sat there and did a list of impacts, it would be huge. And I'm going to pass it over to Mike to add to that list. What are you seeing the impacts of addictions in the workplace to be, Mike?
Yeah, it's a good question. You know, I think for me, at least, I'm not an expert in addiction and mental health. My area of specialty is guiding workplaces on complying with health and safety legislation. And, you know, I think one of the things that has really been a focus over the last few years is not so much addiction, but impairment in the workplace. And so, you know, an individual who's addicted to any substance that comes into the workplace, the concern is, you know, impairment, and you know, whether that is, being inebriated or just, you know, lack of coordination, decrease in reaction times. There's a whole variety of effects that impairment can lead to that can really be a concern in safety sensitive positions. You know, whether a worker is working on a roof or operating heavy equipment or operating a blast furnace or whatever the case is, reaction time is really important. The ability to make good judgment is also important. And unfortunately, like I said, I'm not an expert in this area, but there's very limited evidence or research in this area on the prevalence or the connection between impairment and workplace health and safety. I think it's well known, and I think we can make the conclusion that there is an impact, but there isn't a lot of research in this area. Fortunately, in Ontario, there is the Institute for Work and Health, which has been looking at impairment in the workplace, specifically related to cannabis with the legalization of marijuana over the last couple of years and the impact that it has on workplace health and safety. And, interesting, they found that, individuals who consume cannabis, for example, at the workplace or just before visiting the workplace are actually 2 times more likely to be injured on the job. So that is probably, at least, locally, nationally, is probably one of the strongest pieces of evidence that, that exists, that makes that connection. So really it's unfortunate that there's not more information out there, but I think we can, draw some conclusions that there is a concern for sure.
Right. Thank you. And I thought at this point, we've got a poll that we thought would be interesting to bring up, and I'll voice the responses. And this is an anonymous poll, but we're really interested in hearing what some of the priorities for all of you that are here today and some of the information that you're hoping to learn. So let me launch the poll and we'll go through the questions. Okay, here we go. And it should be showing. It's our untitled poll. But if I were to title it, this would be a poll about addictions in the workplace impacting health and safety. So the first question, you should be able to answer the yes or no or I don't know if the poll, and is the poll showing for you, Mike and Candace? I just wanted to make sure.
It is.
Okay,
yeah.
Perfect.
Yes,
Everyone should be
yes.
seeing the poll. So you can go ahead and put your answers in. Hopefully that it's, I'm not seeing any answers coming in, so I'm not sure if there's a problem with our untitled poll. But if there's not, I have a backup. If
Seems
anyone
to have trouble checking off yes on this one.
Isn't that funny? Okay, isn't that strange?
Yeah.
Well, you know what we'll do? I'll just, for some reason, our poll isn't wanting to cooperate. So how about I read the questions and you can type the number, like number 1 for question 1, and you can write a Y for yes, an N for no, and an I don't know. And some people, it's working for some now, I guess. Okay. There we go. So the first question was, do you feel that naloxone in the workplace is needed? Yes or no? And if you're wondering what is that, not to worry, because Mike and Candace are going to be talking about that. The second question was, how is your workplace handling naloxone? There was a readily available, it will be available soon, or we're uncertain, but we're making it available. Okay, and then there's a question also or an answer to that our workplace is outside of Ontario. So we're just trying to get a handle on where people are from. And the fourth question is, are you aware of any people that you work with that might be having a substance abuse problem? There's yes, no, or I am not sure. The fifth question, and I'll run through the answers. The fifth question is, do you know of anyone at your workplace who has an addicted loved one that they are concerned about? And again, the options are yes, no, I'm not sure. And the last question is asking about addicted, do you know what to say to someone that you believe to have alcohol or drug issues, or they are using in the workplace? Yes, no, I don't know. And then would you like additional information about training on how to recognize addiction and what to do about it? So let me just scroll up to the top so you can all get a sense. So on the first question, which was, how do you feel about having naloxone in the workplaces? Is it needed? About 50% said yes, 42% said no, or sorry, I don't know. And then 8% said no. And then the question about how is your workplace handling naloxone? It's readily available, 21%. It will be available soon, 7%, and 64%, said we're uncertain about making it available. And 7% said we're not making it available right now. The next question had to do with people that you work with that might have a substance abuse issue. 36%, so almost half said yes. 50% said no, 14% said I don't know. And do you know of anyone at your workplace who has an addicted loved one that they are concerned about? 29% said yes, 35% said no, and 36% said I'm not sure. Do you You know what to say to someone that you believe to be using or drinking in your workplace. 57% said, I have an idea, but I'm not sure. 36% said yes, and 7% said no. And then about training, 93% of you said yes. I think it's important to know about this. So thank you for answering those questions. It gives us an opportunity to learn a little bit more about some of your priorities and what's going on in your workplaces as we dive into this very big conversation today. So I'm going to pass that over to you, Mike, first of all, to talk about, there's some legislation coming down in Ontario, Canada, and we're also seeing this similar kind of scenarios ripple out in other provinces of Canada in different ways. So tell us about what's happening in Canada, June, I think it's early June, with respect to safety, and what does this mean for workplaces and employers, not only in Ontario, but beyond as well?
Yeah, so on June 1st, the Occupational Health and Safety Act will have an amendment that will come into force, and it will require employers to make a naloxone kit available where there's a risk of a worker experiencing an opioid overdose. This has been talked about for, I'd say, about a year, just under a year. It was highly contentious. There were those in favor of, making this come into force, and others not so much. But the reality is June 1st, this will come into force. And, it has caused a bit of confusion as to, who requires naloxone in the workplace. And then also, for those who do make naloxone available, and I see there are some on the poll, some of the requirements that they need to put into place to ensure compliance and to ensure that it is effectively used if and ever it's needed. So so this is pretty I would say important to be aware of and to understand, and how it might apply to specific workplaces.
And in addition to that, Mike, is there some specifics of what employers, businesses, organizations, unions should be looking at right now? June is just right around the corner, a couple of weeks from now.
Couple weeks. Hard to believe, but
I know.
Yeah, definitely. So the biggest question that many companies have is, do we need to make naloxone available? The answer to that is not necessarily. And I know that's a lawyer's response, but not necessarily, because it really depends on whether there's a risk. And this is where it gets very confusing, because the legislation, the Section 25.2 in the Occupational Health and Safety Act, is a bit misleading in my opinion. But fortunately, the Ministry of Labor has produced some guidance material to help workplaces understand if there is a risk. Basically, what I say to workplaces is there really needs to be three things in place for you to, have to make naloxone available. Is there a risk factor? And there's some details on what risk factors are. And then also, is there a risk factor that increases the chance of an overdose happening in our workplace? So that's the second thing. And then the third thing is that risk, is the risk of an opioid overdose, does that exist to one of our workers? So is there a risk factor? Can it occur in our workplace, and can it occur to one of our employees? So those three things really need to be true. And then it goes into a little more detail specifically around the risk factors, but we can talk about that later if there's time.
Great. Thank you. And I was going to say, Candace, I'd love to dive into this a bit more with you around when you and I have talked about organizations and companies, businesses having naloxone in the workplace. You said there's some things that are really important to be aware of. One of those is training. Another is how people react to that being administered. So I'd love for you to build on what Mike has said and share, what other considerations should leaders, HR, safety be looking at if this is made available in the workplaces? What do we need to consider?
Sure. Yeah, when you've got somebody who overdoses right in front of you and they fall down and they may be actually dead, this can be very jarring and very traumatic. I don't mean to make light of it at all, because it's horrible for people to watch this. And, even somebody who's trained in giving naloxone, has a real problem with that sometimes. And when you give naloxone to somebody who you're trying to bring back from the edge, a lot of things can happen physically for that person. They can jolt, they can hit you, they're not in control of themselves. They can vomit. There's just a lot of different things that happen when naloxone is given. And so I really believe a couple of things. One is that I think there need to be trained people on every work site that there is naloxone going to be available on. I think, instead of, if I was on your workplace and somebody fell down in front of me, would I know what to do? Would I know how to handle it? I would rather there be somebody who knows what to do and how to handle it. But if I'm there watching this, and especially if I know the person, this is somebody I'm working with, this is a colleague, a friend, and this is happening, I would really hope that there would be some counseling available for people who are observing this or even hear about it. People who are maybe working somewhere else, but they hear that somebody they know went through this today. Do you just go back to work and not talk about it? For me, it would be really important to be able to process those feelings with somebody trained to help you do that.
Yeah, I think that is really important when we think about crisis happening in the workplace, traumatic crises like that kind of aftercare is really important. And I know in the conversations that I've had with some companies, they've been looking sort of really hard at the policies and the sort of the process part, but that aftercare piece is and training people in the workplace about addiction, so people know the signs to look for and what to be concerned about. So what I'm really getting from both of you is that this is a big undertaking in the sense of all of those pieces that need to happen to fit together to keep people safe. So, Mike, one of the things that I was interested in hearing from you as well, you talked about risks, and I wanted to come back to that. So tell us a little bit more when you talked about about risk factors, because we do have time to go there.
Yeah, definitely. So like I mentioned, I will be sending Charmaine some resources. One will be from the Ministry of Labor, Immigration, Training and Skills Development. And they provided some guidance on what the risk factors are. And like I mentioned, is there a risk factor? Is that risk factor present, possibly happening in our workplace to one of our workers? The risk factors that really need to be present are things like, has an overdose already occurred in the workplace? Because, there's a possibility of recurrence. So that would be a risk factor. Has a worker self-disclosed, right? So that's another risk factor. There may be employees who observe someone using in the workplace. That might be another risk factor. And then I think, even just use paraphernalia, things like that. But the one that I think most workplaces would encounter and should be aware of is whether their Joint Health and Safety Committee, their health and safety representative, a member of the union, an HR manager, business partner, administrator, or anyone else in the workplace brings forward a concern that there may be a risk. The employer needs to do something about it, at least look into it and determine whether there is a valid and real risk and whether naloxone needs to be made available. So that's, that really addresses the first concern that many workplaces have. And that question, do we need to make naloxone available? Oh, you're on mute, Charmaine.
Thank you. A question came in, Candace, I'm going to field this over to you. The question was about the impacts of naloxone. First part of the question was, is it addictive? And the second part is there long-term impact that happens if somebody was being administered this often or regularly, sort of more than once?
That is such a great question. To my knowledge, naloxone, which is also known as Narcan, if you hear that word, it's the same drug, and it's easier to say. So Narcan is not addictive to my knowledge. My hope is that naloxone is not being given to very many people over and over again.
Mhm.
And I think that in workplaces, my preference would be to make sure that it's not administered to somebody more than once.
Mhm.
And that doesn't mean that we want somebody to die, like, oh, you've already had Narcan, we can't give it to you again. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a kind of boundary where, if you've had naloxone administered to you, if you have actually overdosed in the workplace, then you need to leave the workplace. You need to go and get treatment. You need to be suspended for a while, and you can have your job back if you successfully complete treatment, so that you're not giving, the same thing isn't happening with one person over and over and over again. That shouldn't be happening, in my opinion. So there need to be consequences that matter to the person that's overdosing. There need to be boundaries and consequences set, that if you overdose and you need to have Narcan given to you, we need to really take a serious look at this. We don't just wait for the next time for it to happen to you.
One of the things I've heard you both speak about, it kind of builds on what you're sharing, Candace, is the importance of getting to the root causes. I remember having a really good conversation with the two of you, and we were talking about how important it is to look at the addiction from a big perspective and not band-aiding it. Candace, I've heard you say, we need to look at not putting band-aids on a heart attack, so to speak,
right,
in terms of how we deal with addictions. And Mike, I've heard you talk about, from the safety perspective, that it's so essential that we look at where might the addiction be stemming from. And I remember you gave an example of chronic pain, for example, that sometimes people are dealing with chronic pain issues that might be coming up in the workplace. And so can you both share a little bit more about that, sort of getting to the root, or making sure that what we set up in our workplace is providing people the supports to keep not only the person who is dealing with addiction issues safe, but everyone else around them, coworkers, clients, customers, the public?
Well, I can start and just saying that addiction, it's really ironic that addiction isn't really about the addiction. That's a symptom of the fact that somebody's having a really, really hard time. My addiction to opioids came about medically when I was diagnosed with Crohn's disease, and the doctors didn't know what else to do for me, so they gave me a lot of addictive medication that anybody's body would get addicted to, and mine definitely did. So there's a line between use of these kinds of medications and abuse of these kinds of medications. I've been on both sides of that line. I'm now on the side of use. I definitely know what the abuse is, but I also know that what we need to do is get underneath addiction and find out what's really going on for that person, so that they don't have to keep doing this, so that they can find other ways to deal with chronic pain if that's what they're dealing with. Until this is why treatment is so important. This is why you don't keep giving Narcan to the same person. You want to get underneath it. Why is this really happening to the person? What do they need? What do they really need? What's really going on for them?
Thank you, Mike.
Yeah, and if I could just add to that, so there is some research in terms of looking at what is sort of the root cause for opioid addiction, and some interesting evidence from the Ontario Drug Policy Research Network. 50% of opioid deaths among workers were a result of fractures, dislocations, and sprains. 48% low back pain. So there's a potential linkage to the workplace, and I think there needs to be some serious consideration as to whether workplace hazards, strenuous work, perpetuates the use of opioids and then potentially long term. And I think that's a very important consideration. And I think it really lends itself well to, you know, putting in place measures and procedures to control hazards and risks, to minimize pain, to minimize, you know, injuries and illnesses that workers may be experiencing. So, you know, and the good news is the Ontario Cancer Research Center, IWH, Institute for Work and Health, are putting in a surveillance program, I think over the next 4 years, that is going to be more closely monitoring opioid related deaths in the workplace, and just learning more about this. So I think that'll be very telling, but early indications, you know, is that there is a root here. And I think there's a strong linkage to workplace hazards and risks that we need to be mindful of.
Thank you.
Yes, and if I could just say, you know, we talked earlier about how when people are under the influence of marijuana, of pot, or alcohol on the job, they can injure themselves. They can make mistakes that will hurt them or somebody else. And so we're looking today, because of naloxone, we're looking today at opioid addiction, because that's what naloxone is for, is to bring somebody back from an opioid overdose. But we also need to be looking at, you know, are your workers high on pot? Are your workers drinking at their break? Are your workers showing up that way? Since pot's been legalized, I know that when I'm driving, and I know what it's like to drive under the influence of pot, nobody should do it. It's fun, but nobody should do it because it's very dangerous. You know, I'm driving along the road, and there's invariably somebody in the car next to me with all the smoke in their car. They're smoking pot on the way to work and are showing up there stoned. So this is an issue that, you know, if you don't want to have opioid addiction, you might want to look at some of the things that come before opioid addiction.
Yeah. Thank you for that. It's really important. And I think one of the pieces that I'm really taking away is that as organizations start to look at this, whether it's looking at the perspective of having naloxone available to be administered in the workplace, or if it's starting from scratch. I know, Mike, you do a lot of work with companies and organizations around policy development. Not every organization has policies about this, and not every organization has strong processes or training to support leaders in being able to deal with this. And how do I address this? And what do I say? And that was one of the questions we asked on the poll, is because I hear from leaders all the time that they struggle with, you know, how do I address this? What do I bring up? But Mike, can you kind of tell us about the what's important about the policies related to addictions in the workplace and naloxone being made available?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, there's probably about 80% who have already made naloxone available, but a larger proportion that are thinking about it or considering and not sure what to do. You know, I will say this, that there are some specific requirements in the Act. There's some, you know, guidance provided by the ministry that I think workplaces need to take into consideration if they will be making naloxone available. You know, there is a requirement to have a workplace naloxone kit, right? That's very specific, because in Ontario, pharmacies, select pharmacies, participating pharmacies do distribute naloxone, but that's part of a public initiative. The workplace naloxone kit is a little bit different, and really, I'm going here, but it's in a hard case, right? So this is, I guess, the most notable difference, is that it's in a hard case, and it's only distributed right now from by St. John's Ambulance and Canadian Red Cross. So that is a requirement. There's actually a whole regulation dedicated to indicating what's in that workplace naloxone kit. So if you are making naloxone available in the workplace, make sure it's a workplace naloxone kit, hard case. And then you also need to document and how you're going to maintain it, because that's a very important consideration. You know, it just like you would with your first aid kit in the workplace, you want to ensure that it's maintained properly, it doesn't expire, nothing is missing. So you need to have documented procedures on how to do that. And, you know, a lot of companies that I've dealt with who have made it available have simply incorporated it into their first aid program and have incorporated into their monthly inspections on first aid equipment. But others do it a little differently. Only supervisors have access to it, and just whatever you do, don't lock it in a desk. That's important, because that's something that I came across once, and it's not a good idea, because in the event it is ever needed, then it's no use in someone's desk. The Occupational Health and Safety Act also outlines a variety of other requirements. The training is a big one as well. There is free training right now on naloxone in the workplace through St. John's, through Canadian Red Cross, and there are other associations and organizations who do make it available. So it's important that whoever's in charge of the naloxone kit is trained. And then you also need to strategically locate it. It has to be in the workplace, readily accessible. If you have multiple shifts, there need to be people in the workplace that have been trained on how to use it on each of the shifts. And that's important. And, one thing that a lot of companies forget too is that you must post the names of those individuals who have been trained in the workplace, just like you would with your Joint Health and Safety Committee and first aid responders. So there are some things that need to be taken into consideration on, selection, on where to purchase, and it's actually free, but where to acquire workplace naloxone, where to place it, who to make responsible for overseeing it and ensuring that it's used properly, the training, and then the maintenance of it.
Thank you. Candace, I wanted to go back to something that you said earlier, because it kind of fits where this conversation has been going. You had made a comment earlier about boundaries, and I wanted you to help us understand the difference between enabling and helping. Because I think sometimes people have great intentions, and it may not be the best for them or the best for the person that they're trying to support or assist. And I wonder if you could share with us that difference.
Yeah, I'd really like to do that. It's one of my favorite things to talk about because it's so important. So there's a really big difference between what we call enabling and helping. When we enable an addict, we're actually doing things for them that they can be doing for themselves, that they should be doing for themselves. And those are the kinds of behaviors that will keep them stuck in addiction. The most common thing that people think about when they think about enabling is giving money to an addict. And that's definitely enabling, because you know where that money is going to go. It's going to go up their nose or in their arm or down their throat. And if you give them money anyway, then you're contributing. You're not the cause of their addiction, but you're definitely contributing to them staying in addiction. What we know is that an enabled addict doesn't recover, because really, why should they? But other ways of enabling are things like allowing, say, an adult child who's an addict to live in the family home, to use or drink in the family home, or game for hours and hours and hours every day. And sometimes what happens is that the family just really wants to help, and they do their laundry for them, and they cook their meals for them. They go out and buy the food for them. It's like the addict doesn't have to do anything for themselves, and that's not good for the addict, and it's not good for the family. So those, the other thing that happens with addicts who are enabled, there's a lot of mood swings if it's mind-altering addiction. So they get really upset about things. They don't like hearing a no. And when they are upset, they punch holes in walls. There's no expectation for them to fix that hole. They push somebody physically out of their way. They do things like that. And if we allow that to happen without consequences, we're contributing to keeping the addict stuck in addiction. So a helping behavior is something that will assist give the addict a fighting chance to recover. So one of the things that the message that is so good to give to an addict in a family, the message is, we love you so much. We love you so much. And because we love you, we're not going to contribute to you continuing your addiction. We don't want that for you. We don't want to see you do that. It tears our hearts out to see you do that. So we're not going to be supporting you in your addiction in any way anymore. That means no money. You may have to pay rent if you want to live here. You may have to cook meals every once in a while. You know, there'd be things that you need to do. Can't use or drink here. Consequences, boundaries that are healthy for the person that's addicted. In a workplace, I think it's very much the same. You might not want to say, we love you, but you might want to say, we care about you. You're our employee and we care about you. And because we care about you, we're not willing to continue supporting you in addiction. If you're coming to work high, we're going to do something about that. If you overdose from an opioid addiction in front of our eyes, we're going to do something about that. After we give you naloxone, there are going to be consequences and boundaries set up, because it's not healthy to support an addict in active addiction. The most loving thing you can do for an addict is to help them get out of addiction, not help them stay in it.
So well said. I know when I was reading your book, I really enjoyed where you talked about setting boundaries and limits. And one of the questions I often get asked with corporate clients when I'm in there teaching, whether it's leadership or resilience or conflict resolution, is sometimes people don't know what to say, so they don't say anything. And I think what you've just raised here is creating some of those scripts for how do I have that conversation? How do I set a boundary? And then how do I follow up on that boundary? Or how do I set that limit and then follow up? And, you know, one of the things that I think is really important here is you bring this perspective, Candace, of being an opioid addict and then now being clean and sober and so healthy for now 30 plus years, 35 years.
Yeah, 35 years.
35 years. And so you come from the perspective of being a therapist and also having gone through this, and you do a lot of work with the loved ones of addicts. So you kind of see these three different perspectives that really come into play when we talk about how do we help people, how do we support them.
Right.
Yes,
that's right.
And there's a question that we can. I'll field this over to who probably you, Candace, and then Mike, if you want to chime in. If someone is hallucinated, can naloxone reverse hallucination or just prevent further hallucinations? Was the question.
If somebody's hallucinating, that's not when you give naloxone. Naloxone is when somebody's passed out in front of you and they're dying before your eyes, and it brings them back to life. So when somebody's hallucinating in front of you, you got to be doing different things than giving naloxone. But it's a very difficult thing to deal with, and especially if you don't have training in how to deal with that in the workplace. It's very scary to be with somebody who's hallucinating. You can't really talk to them. They're not going to listen to you. It's not going to make sense to them because they're busy putting things through their own poisoned brain because they've got the substance in them. That's why they're hallucinating. Very scary stuff. But hallucinations, that's my understanding anyway. Hallucinations are not about naloxone. They're about other things that are very important. If you've got somebody hallucinating in the workplace, who knows what they're going to do? They could do anything. Very dangerous.
Yeah, and I will say, to add to that, you know, the workplace naloxone kits and even the public naloxone kits do come with 2 doses of Narcan, and that's intended to, I think it only lasts approximately 20 to 30 minutes or so in and around there. And oftentimes a second dose may be needed until paramedics can arrive and you know, take control. So, you know, that's another thing to take into consideration as well. It is intended to reverse the effects of an opioid overdose.
And there is talk about, you know, people who are administering naloxone to wear PPE, your personal protective equipment. People are talking about that because, like I say, you know, there are physical things that somebody can do without realizing it. They're not in control of themselves. So you can be kicked, you can be punched, you can be spat on, you can be vomited on. And in today's era, those are really dangerous things to have happen to you. So, yeah, you need to have really good training for administering naloxone.
Yeah. I'm really appreciating that you're both bringing up training, and it's becoming really clear kind of how broad the training needs to be. Mike, you started off talking about policies and making sure that people are adhering to legislation around addictions in the workplace, and if it's about administering naloxone. And then there's the aftercare piece, and then there's the process and who's responsible for what and what must a kit include. It's a really big conversation, but what I'm hearing is that it's really important for not only people that are administering naloxone, if that is the case for a workplace, if they are going to be administering it, be trained, but it's for the organization to understand addiction so that they can best support a colleague, or leaders can best support the people that work in the organization. So policies, training, processes, and it sounds like what I'm hearing from both of you is that these need to be ongoing kind of conversations in a workplace to make sure that ultimately people who need support and help can get to the right support and help. Right.
Yeah, absolutely. And like, just to, go back to the concept of having procedures, documented procedures in place. I was at a hotel once, and a guest was having a cardiac arrest. Nobody knew where the AED machine was, the automatic external defibrillator. They were running around, I think 20 minutes passed before they found one. And even then, none of the staff knew how to use it, despite, today's AEDs being very self-explanatory. They talk to you, they guide you how to use it. That's not a situation you want to be in. So if you make the decision to make naloxone available in the workplace, you want to ensure that, both doses are not missing, that it's not expired, hasn't been subject to, extreme freezing temperatures or extreme heat, because it does have very limited temperature ranges. So it's about putting those measures in place and ensuring that, you are continuously maintaining it.
Yeah, and getting it to the person fast enough
Absolutely.
for it to make a difference.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
I want on the topic of training, I wanted to ask this of both of you too. When we look at making sure that people, employees and leaders in workplaces understand enough about addictions to be able to support people or address issues or concerns that might be arising, any thoughts on what kind of training would be helpful for organizations if they've never done any kind of addictions training before? What would be supportive, Mike, from the safety angle, and Candace from the perspective of helping people get the right help and support?
Yeah,
I think I'm going to defer to Candace on that. I think she's the expert in this.
I feel like I want to defer to Mike on that. I think that there needs to be training for leaders, for HR people on the job, people who are dealing with people who may be addicted. But I also think that those who work with addicts, who think that they're working with somebody who might have an addiction, the training needs to be around, how do you approach somebody on this? What do you say? What are the scripts? How can you do this with compassion? How can you do this with a lack of judgment? Because we need to care about our addicts, and in a family we need to love our addicts, but we need to be healthy while we do that. And we need to have boundaries, and we need to know what to say, because I know that before I cleaned up, people talked to me about my addiction. I wasn't very happy with that. People don't want to hear that somebody thinks they might be addicted. That's the last thing that an addict wants to hear, because it's terrifying for them to think about giving up whatever it is that's helping them get through life. Right. And we need to understand and be as compassionate as we can around it, but also have clear boundaries and consequences, because without those, the addict won't get well, the addict won't change, right? So I think the training needs to be around, what do you say, how do you approach it, how do you maintain compassion while also being frustrated or scared? How do you maintain yourself in that place? And there are definitely ways to do that.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, and in regards to the requirements for opioid training, the person that's been assigned charge of the naloxone kits in the workplace need to receive training on a variety of topics. How to recognize an opiate overdose and how to administer it are probably the two most important ones. But they may also require some instruction on how to inspect the kits. So, one thing I think, is really important is to open it up. If you are, carrying out monthly inspections, open the kit up and make sure that each of the contents are contained within it. There is a specific, like I mentioned, a specific regulation on the contents of that kit. So you want to ensure that those are all there. They're not expired. They're not broken or anything like that. So the training right now is available through St. John's Ambulance and Canadian Red Cross, but you definitely want to ensure that person in charge understands and recognizes the signs of an opiate overdose, and then also how to properly administer naloxone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'd like to just piggyback on that too, and say that, for people who are being trained in giving naloxone, there are going to be feelings that they're feeling too, a whole lot of stress, a whole lot of anxiety. There's somebody there that's dying in front of them. What if this doesn't work? What if I do it wrong? Even if it works, even if that person comes back to life, all these feelings that could be flooding somebody that's giving the naloxone, my hope is that there would be somebody made available to your organization that could come and talk to that person, even if it's over Zoom. Talk to somebody, let them express what this has been like for them.
Couldn't agree more with you both.
It's critical incidents, kinds of stuff, and it's really important.
It really is that making sure people are supported, making sure there's aftercare, that people don't have to go through this on their own. And I've heard you talk, this is probably another webinar conversation with you both, but I know both of you are strong advocates for organizations making sure that they have training or support to support the mental health and well-being of employees. With related to addictions, but even beyond, people that are going through challenging times in their life. And we're certainly seeing the statistics of mental health dramatically on the increase since COVID, and the number of people that have been affected in many different ways. So I really encourage all of you in your workplaces to take stock. Mike kind of gave the example of doing an inventory, and I think there's lots of things that we can inventory in our workplace, and one of them might be, what are the training needs? And if you're wondering what the training needs are, a great exercise, one of my clients just did this recently. They were looking at what training do their employees need around mental health, for example, and the employees created a great list of what they most needed to know to be able to manage their own lives and to be able to support the people that they worked with. So your employees will have great answers about what kind of training is needed. Before we wrap up, this time goes so fast with the two of you. I feel like we should have booked half a day. We will have more conversations, but I wanted to just, before we close out, and before people might have to rush right at the top of the hour, Candace and Mike, if you could share with people where they can get in touch with you besides LinkedIn. Honestly, go follow Candace and Mike on LinkedIn, go connect with them, follow their posts, because the two of them are posting genius content, such helpful content for workplaces, for leaders, employees. So do that. And then Mike and Candace, where do people find you? What your website, any contact information you want to give out?
My website is Love with Boundaries, because we have to love, but we have to love with boundaries, lovewithboundaries.com. And if any of you are family members of somebody with an addiction, We offer counseling for that. We have a few different programs, and we have a free 30-minute consultation that we'll give you to see what's happening for you, tell you about our programs, see if we're fit. You know, there's help out there for you if you're in the situation, because we know how desperate you're feeling.
Yeah, and I've just entered my email address and my LinkedIn page in the chat for those who have any other questions related to this or anything regarding managing workplace health and safety. That's my specialty in occupational hygiene. So I'm happy to connect with anybody who has any questions following this. And I just want to thank you again, Charmaine, for inviting me. This is great conversation, timely in Ontario, especially.
Yes, thank you. And we'll make sure that in the follow-up resources, when we send out the recording, that we also get you Candace's and Mike's contact information, their website, their LinkedIn, and all of that. And I know they've got some great information to share. As we pull together today's webinar, I just want to thank all of you for joining us to be part of this conversation. This is all part of my goal is to help organizations be psychologically safe and healthy and create teams that work better together, and looking at all of the different issues and challenges that teams navigate. And one of those is what we talked about today, addictions and changes in policies and legislation. Mike and Candace, I want to thank you both for your honesty and being so candid about a topic that is tough for a lot of us to talk about. And sometimes we don't know what questions to ask. And again, I encourage you all, if you had a question to ask but didn't know how to frame it, or you're just becoming aware of the question now, feel free to send that to me and I'll send that out to Mike and Candace, or you can connect with them directly. And again, thank you so much for joining us, and let's go out and be safe and healthy. Candace and Mike, any final word as we close out?
No, just thanks again for hosting the conversation, and looking forward to connecting with anybody who has questions.
Yeah, and I guess what I would say is just don't give up. Don't ever give up trying to help somebody with an addiction. It's, you know, if they're still here, there's still hope.
Beautiful. Thank you. And we'll be sending the recording out soon. Thank you so much for joining us.